The Abandoned Bride. Elena Parker stood alone on the Wyoming platform as the last passenger wagon disappeared into dust, clutching a worn letter that promised marriage to a man who never came. She had crossed 1,500 miles with her life savings sewn into her hem, and now, beneath a merciless summer sun in a town where no one knew her name, she realized the truth. She had been deceived, abandoned, and left with nothing but the clothes on her back and nowhere to go. If you want to know how a woman survives when every door closes and every promise breaks, stay with me until the end of this story. Please hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far Elena's journey reaches. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat one final time before the Iron Beast rolled westward, leaving Elena Parker standing on the wooden platform with a single carpet bag and a heart that beat too fast. Around her, the town of Stillwater, Wyoming, materialized through waves of heat, a main street of sun-bleached buildings, horses tied to posts, and people who moved with the slow certainty of those who belonged. She didn't belong. Elena smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress, already damp with perspiration, and searched the dispersing crowd for a face she'd seen only in a single photograph. Thomas Whitmore. The man who'd written her 3 letters over 4 months, each one more insistent than the last. A good woman is needed here, a partnership built on mutual respect. Come west, and we'll build something together. The platform emptied. Families reunited with embraces and laughter. A rancher collected supply crates. 2 cowboys tipped their hats to a woman in calico. And Elena stood motionless, watching them all disappear into lives that made sense while hers unraveled with each passing minute. "Miss? You waiting for someone?" She turned to find the station master, an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face, standing beside her with concern etched into every line. "I'm meeting my fiancé," Elena said, hearing the uncertainty in her own voice. "Thomas Whitmore. He was supposed to be here." The station master's expression shifted, not confusion, but something worse, recognition mixed with pity. "Whitmore? Missed. There's no one by that name in Stillwater. Never has been, far as I know." The words landed like physical blows. Elena fumbled with the clasp of her handbag, pulling out the letters with trembling fingers. "But he wrote to me 3 times. He described this town, this station. May I?" The station master took the letters gently, scanning them with a practiced eye that suggested he'd seen this before. When he looked up, his face had gone soft with sympathy. "Miss, I'm real sorry, but this is a fraud. These letters, they're written by men who prey on women looking for new starts. They take money, make promises, and then—" He gestured at the empty platform. Elena's vision blurred. She'd paid Thomas Whitmore $45, sent in 3 installments over 3 months, for travel arrangements and household necessities. Money she'd saved for 2 years working as a seamstress in Philadelphia, living in a boarding house where the walls were thin and the future was thinner. "I sent him everything I had," she whispered. The station master pressed the letters back into her hands. "You got family you can wire? Somewhere to go back to?" Back to what? The cramped room where she'd stitched hems until her fingers bled? The factory owner's son who'd made it clear that a woman alone was fair game for whatever he wanted? The Philadelphia streets where she'd never be anything more than cheap labor with no prospects and no future? "No," Elena said. "There's nothing to go back to. The boarding house on 3rd Street might have a room. I have $6 left." The words tasted like ash. After the train ticket, the meals, the small trunk she'd shipped ahead that was probably sitting in some warehouse unclaimed, this was what remained of 2 years of hope. The station master's jaw worked silently. Then he sighed. "Go to the general store. Ask for Mrs. Brennan. She might know of work." Elena nodded because there was nothing else to do. She picked up her carpet bag, the weight of her entire life reduced to 10 pounds of fabric and foolish dreams, and walked down the platform steps into Stillwater. The town revealed itself in brutal detail. 3 saloons within sight, their doors propped open to release the smell of whiskey and tobacco. A blacksmith's forge sending sparks into the dry air. Women in bonnets who glanced her way with the particular assessment reserved for strangers in trouble. Men who looked too long at a woman traveling alone. The general store stood at the corner of Main and 2nd, its painted sign promising dry goods and provisions. Elena pushed through the door into relative coolness, where barrels of flour and sugar lined the walls, and the scent of coffee and leather hung in the still air. A woman in her 50s stood behind the counter, silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe bun, measuring out nails for a customer. When she finished, she turned sharp eyes on Elena. "Help you?" "I'm looking for Mrs. Brennan." "You found her." The woman's gaze swept over Elena's travel-worn dress, her single bag, her empty hands. "You're the one who came for Whitmore." It wasn't a question. Elena felt heat flood her face. "The station master said you might know of work." Mrs. Brennan's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her eyes, a recognition of one woman's trouble by another who'd seen it all before. "What can you do?" "I can sew. I was a seamstress in Philadelphia. I can cook, clean, keep accounts." "Every woman in Stillwater can do those things." Mrs. Brennan crossed her arms. "What makes you worth hiring when you've got no references and no reputation here?" The words were harsh, but they were honest. Elena lifted her chin. "Because I'm desperate enough to work harder than anyone else you could hire, and I've got nowhere else to go. That makes me reliable." For the first time, Mrs. Brennan's mouth twitched toward something that might become a smile. "You got spine, at least. That's something." She pulled a ledger from beneath the counter. "I can't hire you. I've got my daughter working here. But there's a rancher comes in regular, widower with a boy, needs help with the house. He's too proud to ask directly, but I've seen how things are going out there." Hope flickered, dangerous and painful. "Would he hire me?" "Might, if you can survive his disposition." Mrs. Brennan wrote something on a scrap of paper. "Caleb Morgan. Has a ranch about 5 miles north. Lost his wife 2 years back, and from what I've seen, he's been barely keeping things together since." The door opened, bells jangling, and a man walked in. Tall and weathered, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes that had seen too much. He moved with the economical grace of someone who'd spent his life working land, but there was something else there too. A heaviness, a man carrying weight that wasn't visible. "Mr. Morgan," Mrs. Brennan said, "this is Elena Parker. She's looking for work." Those eyes, gray as winter sky, fixed on Elena with an intensity that made her want to step back. But she'd run too far already. She held her ground. "What kind of work?" His voice was rough, like it didn't get used much for conversation. "Housekeeping, cooking, whatever needs doing." Elena kept her voice steady. "Mrs. Brennan mentioned you might need help at your ranch." "I don't need charity cases." The word stung, but Elena had been poor too long to let pride get in the way of survival. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering labor in exchange for room and board. You need work done. I need a place to stay. That's business, not charity." Caleb Morgan studied her with an expression that gave away nothing. The silence stretched until Elena could hear her own heartbeat, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of horses on the street outside. "You know anything about ranching?" "No, but I can learn." "You know anything about cooking for working men?" "I can cook for anyone who's hungry enough to eat it." Something flickered in those gray eyes, not amusement exactly, but acknowledgement. "You got family, husband coming?" "No one." The truth of it sat heavy in her chest. "Why'd you come west?" Elena met his gaze directly. "Because I was promised something better than what I had. That promise was a lie, but I'm here now, and I'm not going back." The silence returned, but this time it felt different, like the space before a decision gets made and everything changes. "Mr. Morgan, The door banged open with enough force to rattle the jars on the shelves. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, burst through with dirt on his knees and wild hope in his eyes. "Pa! Mrs. Brennan said there was someone—" The boy stopped dead when he saw Elena, his mouth falling open. In the sudden stillness, Elena saw the resemblance, the same gray eyes, the same dark hair, the same bone structure waiting to grow into his father's face. But where Caleb Morgan's expression was carefully controlled, the boy's face showed everything: loneliness, longing, and something that looked painfully like recognition. "Evan," Caleb said quietly, "this is Miss Parker. She's—" "Mama?" The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock in every direction. Mrs. Brennan inhaled sharply. Caleb froze, his face draining of color. And Elena felt her heart break for a child who was so desperate for something lost that he'd try to find it in a stranger's face. "Evan, no!" Caleb's voice cracked on the words. "She's not." But the boy was already moving, crossing the space between them with the single-minded purpose of a child who'd spotted hope in the wilderness. He stopped in front of Elena, tilting his head back to look up at her with eyes that begged for something she couldn't give. "You came back," Evan whispered. "I knew you would." Elena's throat closed. She'd come west looking for a future, and instead she'd stumbled into someone else's grief. She knelt down slowly, bringing herself to the boy's eye level, and spoke as gently as she knew how. "Sweetheart, I'm not your mama. I'm sorry." Evan's face crumpled, but he didn't cry. Instead, he reached out and touched her hand with fingers that trembled. "But you could be. You could stay and be my mama. Pa needs help, and I'd be real good, I promise. I wouldn't make trouble." Behind them, Caleb made a sound that might have been pain or anger, or both. "Evan, that's enough. Let Miss Parker go." But the boy's hand tightened on hers. Please don't leave." Elena looked at that small, desperate face and saw her own reflection. Someone who'd traveled too far to turn back now. Someone who needed a place to belong as much as Evan needed someone to belong to. She glanced up at Caleb Morgan and found him watching her with an expression that had gone beyond careful control into something raw and unguarded. "If I stay," Elena said slowly, "it would be as a housekeeper, someone who works for your pa and helps take care of things, not as a mama. Do you understand?" Evan nodded so hard his hair fell into his eyes. "But you'd stay? You wouldn't leave?" "I'd stay as long as I'm needed and welcome." The boy turned to his father with desperate hope. "Pa, can she? Please?" Caleb Morgan looked between his son and the stranger who'd walked into their lives through nothing but bad luck and worse timing. Elena watched something shift behind those gray eyes. A door opening just a crack after being locked too long. 2 weeks, Caleb said finally. "Trial period. Room and board in exchange for housework and cooking. You don't work out? You go. No debate." It wasn't warm. It wasn't even particularly welcoming. But it was a chance, and that was more than Elena had when she stepped off the train. "Agreed," she said. Evan let out a whoop that made Mrs. Brennan smile despite herself. He grabbed Elena's hand and pulled her toward the door. "Come on, I gotta show you the ranch, and the chickens, and my room, and—" "Evan," Caleb's voice stopped the boy mid-stride. "Miss Parker needs to get her things first, and we need to settle accounts here." He moved to the counter, pulling coins from his pocket to pay for whatever supplies he'd come for. Mrs. Brennan caught Elena's eye while he wasn't looking and mouthed, "Be patient with him." 20 minutes later, Elena found herself in a wagon beside Caleb Morgan, with Evan wedged between them chattering about everything and nothing. The new calf in the barn, the treehouse he wanted to build, the fishing spot down by the creek. Caleb drove in silence, but his son's voice filled the space between them like water finding cracks in stone. The ranch appeared after a long curve in the road, a 2-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, surrounded by outbuildings in various states of disrepair. Fences needed mending. Weeds had claimed the vegetable garden. But beyond the neglect, Elena could see bones of something that had once been beautiful. A house built with care, a barn constructed to last, land that stretched toward mountains in the distance. "It needs work," Caleb said flatly, as if expecting judgment. "So do I," Elena replied. "Guess we're even." He glanced at her sideways, and for just a moment, something that might have been respect flickered across his face. The house interior told the story Mrs. Brennan had only hinted at. Dust coated every surface. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. Clothes lay in piles waiting for attention that never came. In the main room, a stone fireplace stood cold despite the evening chill creeping in. The furniture, a worn sofa, 2 chairs, a table scarred with use, spoke of a family that had once lived here with care and purpose. But in the corner, on a small shelf, sat a photograph in a silver frame. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, smiling at whoever held the camera. Beside her stood a younger Caleb, his arm around her waist, his face open in a way that seemed impossible now. "That's Mama," Evan said quietly, following Elena's gaze. "She got sick 2 winters ago. Pa says she's in heaven now, but sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like." Elena's chest tightened. "What do you remember?" "She sang when she cooked, and she always smelled like bread and soap." Evan touched the photograph gently. "Do you think she'd mind? That you're here?" It was the kind of question only a child could ask, honest and terrible and necessary. Elena knelt beside him, looking at the woman in the photograph who'd left behind a husband turned to stone and a son who still reached for ghosts. "I think," Elena said carefully, "that your mama would want you and your pa to be happy. And if I can help with that, even a little, then I think she'd be glad." Evan studied her face with the seriousness of someone much older. Then he nodded, satisfied by whatever he saw there. "I'm going to show you where everything is. Pa needs to check the horses, but I can teach you." For the next hour, Evan gave Elena a tour that revealed more through absence than presence. His mother's sewing basket sat untouched, thread still wound on spindles. The kitchen garden had grown wild, but Elena could see the layout of what had been: carefully planned rows, herbs near the door, space for vegetables in the sun. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms. Caleb's sparse and functional, Evan's cluttered with the possessions of childhood, and a third that sat empty except for a bed and dresser, waiting for purpose. "This can be your room," Evan announced. "Mama used it for sewing, but she wouldn't mind." Elena set her carpet bag on the bed and looked out the window at the ranch spreading below, all that neglected potential waiting for hands willing to work. She'd imagined many futures when she boarded that train in Philadelphia, but never this, standing in a dead woman's sewing room, in a house held together by grief and stubborn refusal to surrender, with a child who'd mistaken her for answered prayer. The sun was setting when Caleb finally came inside, dust on his shoulders and weariness in every line of his body. He stopped short when he saw the kitchen, not transformed, but changed. Elena had cleared the dishes, wiped down the table, started a fire in the stove. The smell of coffee filled the air, sharp and real. "Evan's washing up," Elena said, nodding toward the pump outside where she could hear the boys splashing. "I found beans and salt pork. It's not much, but it's something." Caleb stared at the simple meal she'd laid out like it was a miracle instead of necessity. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did. We had an agreement. This is me holding up my end." He poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, and Elena realized this might be the first hot meal prepared by someone else that he'd had in 2 years. They ate in silence, broken only by Evan's chatter when he returned, talking about everything except the enormous thing happening, their house coming back to life. After Evan went to bed, but not before making Elena promise 3 times that she'd still be there in the morning, Caleb and Elena sat across from each other at the kitchen table with cooling coffee and the weight of things unsaid. "I need to know something," Caleb said finally. "What happened with Whitmore? Was he the only reason you came west?" Elena wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. "I came west because staying east meant dying slow in a boarding house, working myself to nothing for pennies, and waiting for some factory boss to decide I was desperate enough to accept whatever he offered. Whitmore was the excuse I needed to leave. The lie he told just happened faster than the one I was already living." Caleb's jaw worked silently. "You got people who'll come looking? Anyone who'll make trouble?" "No one cares enough to look." The truth of that sat between them, 2 people who'd ended up in the same place through different paths of loss and necessity. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkening land, wild and lonesome. "The boy," Caleb started, then stopped. Started again. "Evan hasn't talked this much since Sarah died. I don't know if that's good or dangerous." "It's good," Elena said firmly. "Silence doesn't heal anything. It just makes wounds go deeper." "You think you know that after 1 day here?" "I know what happens when you stop talking, when you decide the only way to survive is to feel nothing." Elena met his eyes across the table. "I've seen men do it in the factories. Women do it in the boarding houses. They're still breathing, but they're not alive anymore. Your son is still alive, Mr. Morgan. Don't punish him for that." Something dangerous flashed in Caleb's face. Anger or pain or recognition. You don't know anything about what we've been through. You're right, I don't. Elena stood, collecting the cups with steady hands. But I know what it looks like when someone's drowning on dry land. I've been doing it myself for 2 years, so maybe I can't understand your loss, but I can recognize it. She left him sitting at the table, staring into his empty cup like it held answers. Upstairs, she unpacked her few belongings in the sewing room that still smelled faintly of lavender, and wondered what on earth she'd gotten herself into. Through the thin walls, she heard Evan's voice, not words, just the rise and fall of a child talking to himself in the dark. Then Caleb's deeper tones, responding. A conversation too quiet to make out, but there nonetheless. The sound of a father trying, even when trying, hurt. Elena lay in the darkness of her new room and felt the ranch settling around her. The creak of old wood, the whisper of wind against glass, the distant restlessness of horses in the barn. She'd come west chasing a lie and found something more complicated than she'd imagined. A family broken by loss, a home abandoned by hope, and a chance to build something real from the wreckage of everyone's shattered plans. Tomorrow she'd start putting things right. Tonight, she'd let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, getting abandoned on a train platform in the middle of Wyoming wasn't the worst thing that could have happened. Maybe it was exactly where she needed to be. The first light came through the sewing room window with the insistence of something that wouldn't be ignored, pulling Elena from a sleep that had been more exhaustion than rest. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the smell of dust and old lavender, the distant sound of roosters announcing the day. Then memory returned with the weight of everything that had brought her here. The empty train platform, the lie that had shaped itself into Thomas Whitmore, the desperate bargain she'd made with a widower and his grieving son. She dressed quickly in the gray work dress she'd brought, pinned her dark hair into a practical bun, and made her way downstairs. The house was silent, but through the kitchen window she could see Caleb already out by the barn, his movements efficient and solitary in the pale morning light. No sign of Evan yet. Elena surveyed the kitchen with the practiced eye of someone who'd made do with less. The stove needed proper cleaning, the shelves wanted organizing, and the floor hadn't seen a good scrubbing in longer than she wanted to consider. But there was flour in the barrel, eggs in the cold box, and lard in the crock. Enough to make breakfast that might remind this house what normal felt like. She built up the fire, found a mixing bowl that needed washing first, and set to work. Her hands remembered the rhythm of biscuit dough even though her mind was elsewhere, wondering what Caleb expected, what Evan needed, what she'd gotten herself into by accepting 2 weeks in a place where grief sat in every corner like unwelcome furniture. The back door opened just as she was sliding the biscuits into the oven. Caleb stopped short when he saw her, his hat in his hands, surprise flickering across his face before the careful blankness returned. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." Elena wiped her hands on the apron she'd found hanging by the door, probably Sarah's. "Coffee's ready. Biscuits in about 20 minutes. He poured himself a cup with the wariness of someone expecting disappointment, then took a sip. Something in his shoulders relaxed fractionally. "It's good." "It's coffee. Hard to ruin coffee." Elena began cracking eggs into a bowl. "How do you and Evan take your eggs?" "However they come." "That's not an answer, Mr. Morgan. That's resignation disguised as flexibility." He almost smiled. Almost. "Scrambled, with salt and pepper if there is any." "There is." Elena had found both in the cupboard, along with other spices that had been ignored so long they'd nearly lost their scent. "Does Evan sleep late?" "He's usually up by now. I'll check on him." But before Caleb could move toward the stairs, the sound of small feet thundering down them announced Evan's arrival. The boy burst into the kitchen, still in his nightshirt, his hair sticking up in wild angles. He stopped when he saw Elena, and his whole face transformed with relief so profound it hurt to witness. "You're still here," Evan breathed. "I said I would be." Elena crouched down to his level. "But you need to get dressed before breakfast. Clean clothes if you have them." Evan nodded seriously and raced back upstairs with the same energy he'd brought down. Caleb watched him go with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. "He thinks you're going to disappear," Caleb said quietly, "like she did. Then I'll have to prove I'm different." Elena turned back to the eggs. How long since this house had regular meals? Define regular. Same time every day. Food that isn't just fuel. Caleb's silence was answer enough. Elena heard him move behind her, pouring another cup of coffee, settling into the chair at the table. When she glanced back, he was watching her work with the focused attention of someone trying to figure out a puzzle. What? She asked. Most women would have run when Evan called them mama. Wouldn't have stayed the night, much less started cooking breakfast like this was normal. Most women didn't get stranded in Wyoming with $6 and nowhere to go. Elena whisked the eggs with more force than necessary. Besides, running from one child's grief when I've been carrying my own seemed like cowardice. That what you've been doing? Carrying grief? Elena paused, considering whether to answer honestly. Outside the window, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning haze and revealing the ranch in full detail. The work that needed doing, the life that wanted living. My mother died when I was 12. My father followed 6 months later. I've been taking care of myself ever since, working in factories and sewing rooms, watching other people have families while I just tried to survive. So when you ask if I've been carrying grief, yes, Mr. Morgan, I have. Just a different kind than yours. The silence that followed felt different than the careful distance of the night before. It felt like understanding, or the beginning of it. Evan returned in clothes that were clean but rumpled, his hair still defying gravity. He climbed into his chair and watched Elena dish out eggs and biscuits with an expression of wonder that made her chest ache. This looks like real breakfast, Evan said. As opposed to fake breakfast. Elena set a plate in front of him. Pa makes Johnny cakes sometimes. Or we have jerky and water. Elena looked at Caleb, who had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed. I'm not much of a cook. Then it's good I am. Elena sat down with her own plate, and for a moment they were just 3 people sharing a meal in the morning quiet. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of scene that must have played out in this kitchen 1,000 times before Sarah died and took normalcy with her. Evan ate like he was afraid the food might vanish if he slowed down, but he kept looking up at Elena between bites, checking that she was still there. Caleb ate methodically, his eyes moving between his son and the stranger who'd somehow landed in their lives. What needs doing today? Elena asked when the plates were mostly clean. Caleb blinked. What? Around the ranch. What work needs doing that I can help with? You're the housekeeper. The house needs keeping. The house needs a lot of things, but I can't do all of them in one day, so what's the priority? Elena began clearing plates. And before you tell me it's none of my concern, remember that we have an agreement, room and board for useful work. I intend to be useful. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, respect or wariness or both. The vegetable garden. It was Sarah's, and after I couldn't maintain it, but it's summer. There's still time to plant things that'll produce before frost. Elena nodded. Then that's where I'll start after I get the kitchen in order. I can show you where everything is, Evan offered eagerly. Mama had tools in the shed, and she marked out all the rows special. That would be helpful, thank you. Elena smiled at him, and the boy beamed like she'd given him something precious. Caleb stood, settling his hat back on his head. I've got fence to mend in the north pasture. Evan, you help Miss Parker this morning, but stay where I can see you from the fence line. Yes, sir. Evan was already bouncing toward the door. Mr. Morgan, Elena said, stopping Caleb before he could follow. I know this arrangement is strange, but I meant what I said about holding up my end. You don't have to trust me yet, but I'm asking you to let me try. He studied her with those gray eyes that gave away nothing and everything. 2 weeks, Miss Parker. Then we'll see. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Elena took it as the opening it was. The morning revealed itself in layers of work and discovery. The kitchen took 2 hours to scrub clean, surfaces that hadn't been properly wiped in months, dishes that needed soaking, floors that required hands and knees and determination. But when Elena finished, the room looked different. Not perfect, but purposeful. Like a place where life happened instead of where it had stopped. Evan led her outside to the garden plot, chattering the entire way about his mother's planting system, which vegetables grew best where, How she'd sung while she worked and let him help with the weeding even though he mostly just dug holes in the wrong places. Elena listened and let him talk, understanding that these stories were how he kept Sarah alive. The garden itself broke her heart a little. Carefully planned rows now choked with weeds, raised beds collapsing, the tool shed door hanging crooked on broken hinges. But underneath the neglect, she could see the love that had built this, the work of hands that had meant for things to grow and thrive. Mama said gardens were like people, Evan said, kneeling beside a patch of wild mint that had somehow survived. They need tending regular, or they go wild and forget what they're supposed to be. Elena pulled on the work gloves she'd found in the shed. Your mama sounds like she was wise. She was the best. Evan's voice carried the simple certainty of a child's love. Pa says I'm too young to remember her good, but I do. I remember lots of things. Tell me one while we work. So Evan talked, his small hands pulling weeds alongside hers, and Elena learned about Sarah Morgan in fragments, the way she hummed off-key, her perfect apple pie, how she could calm the horses just by talking to them, the bedtime stories she made up about rabbits who lived in the mountains. With each story, Elena felt the weight of filling a space that had belonged to someone irreplaceable, but she kept working anyway because the alternative was giving up before she'd even started. By midday, they'd cleared 3 rows and found tomato plants that had somehow self-seeded and survived. Small victories, but they counted. Evan ran to show his father when Caleb came in for the noon meal, dragging him by the hand to see what they'd accomplished. Look, Pa, we found Mama's tomatoes. They came back all by themselves. Caleb stood at the edge of the garden, staring at the cleared rows and rescued plants with an expression Elena couldn't read. His throat worked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just nodded. That's good, son. Real good. Elena had prepared a simple lunch, bread and cheese and the last of the preserves from the cellar. They ate on the porch, watching the land stretch away toward the mountains, and Elena realized she hadn't thought about Thomas Whitmore or her abandoned plans for hours. She'd been too busy living. There's a town meeting tonight, Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. At the church. Usually just the established families go, but folks will have heard about your situation. They'll want to see you. Elena's stomach tightened. To judge whether I'm respectable enough to be here? To decide whether to help you or make trouble. Caleb's voice was matter of fact. Small towns are like that. You're either part of things or you're not. What do you think they'll decide? I think Mrs. Brennan will speak for you, and that counts for something. The rest depends on how you carry yourself. He looked at her directly. Can you handle being stared at and whispered about? Elena thought about the factory floors where men had said worse things to her face, the boarding house where she'd been nobody worth noticing, the train platform where she'd stood alone while her dreams crumbled. I've survived worse than small-town gossip, Mr. Morgan. I'll manage. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. We'll go together, all 3 of us. That night, Elena put on her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but it was clean and respectable, and braided her hair in a way that suggested propriety rather than desperation. When she came downstairs, Evan was waiting in clothes that had been brushed clean, and Caleb had put on a jacket that must have been gathering dust in his wardrobe. You look pretty, Evan announced with the honesty of children. Thank you. You look very handsome. Elena straightened his collar. Remember, tonight we're showing people that we're a household that takes care of itself. That means best behavior. Yes, ma'am. Evan took her hand naturally, like they'd been doing this for years instead of barely 2 days. The church sat at the edge of town, white paint gleaming in the evening light. Wagons and horses crowded the area outside, and through the open doors, Elena could hear the murmur of gathered voices. Her palms went damp, but she kept her spine straight and her chin up as they walked inside. The conversations died in waves as people noticed them. Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her. The stranger, the abandoned bride, the woman now living under Caleb Morgan's roof with only a child as chaperone. She could read the questions in their faces. What kind of woman travels alone to meet a man she's never seen? What kind of arrangement had she made with the widower? Was she desperate or calculating or simply foolish? Mrs. Brennan appeared beside them like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Caleb, Evan, She nodded to Elena. Miss Parker, glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, Elena said, injecting more confidence into her voice than she felt. Come on then, I'll introduce you around. Mrs. Brennan looped her arm through Elena's with the territorial authority of someone claiming ownership. Folks, this is Elena Parker, who's helping Caleb with the housekeeping. Elena, this is just about everyone who matters in Stillwater. What followed was a blur of names and faces, ranchers and their wives, the shopkeepers, the school teacher, the minister. Some greeted her with cautious warmth, others with cool assessment. But through it all, Mrs. Brennan stayed close, and Caleb stood nearby with Evan, a quiet presence that suggested Elena had his backing even if he wasn't effusive about it. The meeting itself was routine business, discussion of the upcoming Harvest Festival, plans for a new schoolhouse, debate about expanding the railroad spur. Elena sat between Mrs. Brennan and Evan, trying to look engaged and respectable and like she belonged in this room full of people who'd built lives together while she'd been stitching hems in Philadelphia. Afterward, as people lingered over coffee and conversation, a woman approached, younger than Elena by a few years, blonde and pretty, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miss Parker, is it? I'm Lucy Hartwell. I've known Caleb and his family for years. The emphasis on years carried unmistakable meaning. It must be quite an adjustment coming from the city to a ranch. Everything's an adjustment, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm learning. I'm sure. Lucy's gaze swept over Elena's worn dress. Though I wonder if you understand what ranch life really entails. It's not just keeping house. It's isolation, hard work, and winters that can kill the unprepared. Some women aren't suited for it. Before Elena could respond, Mrs. Brennan materialized with the timing of divine intervention. Lucy, dear, weren't you just telling me how overwhelmed you've been with the children? Perhaps you should worry less about Miss Parker's suitability and more about your own household. Lucy's smile went brittle. I was only trying to help. Of course you were. Mrs. Brennan's tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to discuss the Harvest Festival Committee with Elena. Lucy retreated with her pride barely intact, and Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. That was just the opening salvo. Mrs. Brennan lowered her voice. Lucy had her sights set on Caleb after Sarah died, figured she'd be the one to comfort the grieving widower. Your arrival complicated that plan. Elena's stomach sank. I'm not here for... I didn't come to... I know that. You know that. But Lucy doesn't, and neither do half the women in this room who are wondering if you are a schemer or a victim or something in between. Mrs. Brennan squeezed her arm. So here's my advice. Hold your head up, work hard, and let your actions speak louder than anyone's speculation. Eventually, they'll find something else to talk about. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Evan already drowsing against Elena's side. When they pulled up to the house, Caleb helped her down from the wagon, with a hand that was steady and impersonal. You did well tonight, he said. I survived. That's not the same thing. In Stillwater, sometimes it is. He lifted Evan carefully, the boy mumbling in his sleep. I'll get him to bed. You can turn in if you want. But Elena was too restless for sleep. She lit a lamp in this kitchen and began planning the next day's work. More garden clearing, laundry that couldn't wait any longer, mending that she'd noticed piling up in the basket by Sarah's old sewing chair. Useful work to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the judgment she'd felt in that church, the speculation about her motives, the impossible task of proving herself to people who'd already decided what they thought. She was elbow-deep in planning when Caleb came back downstairs, moving quiet through the house like he was used to not disturbing anyone. He stopped when he saw her still at the table. Thought you'd be asleep. Too much in my head, Elena gestured to the list she'd been making. I'm trying to prioritize what needs doing most. Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot she'd kept warm and sat across from her, the same position they'd been in the night before, but the space between them felt different now, less like strangers negotiating terms, and more like two people trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without collision. What Lucy said tonight, Caleb began, about not being suited for ranch life, was her trying to protect her territory. Mrs. Brennan explained. Elena met his eyes. I'm not here to take your wife's place, Mr. Morgan, or to position myself as the next Mrs. Morgan. I'm here because I needed work and you needed help, and that's the extent of it. I know. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. But people will talk regardless, and I need you to understand what that means. In a town like this, reputation matters, especially for women. I lost my reputation the moment I stepped off that train looking for a man who didn't exist. Elena's voice was steady. All I have now is my work and my word. So I'll work harder than anyone expects and keep my word better than anyone doubts. And eventually, maybe that'll be enough. Caleb studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. Sarah used to say something similar, that actions counted more than opinions. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly to her, and Elena felt the weight of it, being compared to the woman whose absence shaped everything in this house. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Elena said carefully. She was. The words carried grief that had aged into something permanent. And I'm not looking to replace her. I want you to understand that too. I do. They sat in silence for a moment, two damaged people trying to make something workable out of necessity. Outside, nightbirds called across the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl rose and fell. The 2 weeks, Caleb said finally. If you make it through and you want to stay on, we'll need to make proper arrangements. Separate living quarters, maybe. Or a formal contract that makes it clear this is employment, nothing else. Whatever protects all of us, Elena agreed. I'm not here to cause scandal or confusion. I'm just here to survive and help others do the same. Caleb nodded slowly. Then we understand each other. I believe we do, Mr. Morgan. Caleb. The correction was quiet but deliberate. If you're going to be living here, even temporarily, you should call me Caleb. Only if you call me Elena. Fair enough. He stood, carrying his cup to the basin. Get some rest. Tomorrow's Sunday. Evan will want to show you the creek before it gets too hot. Elena watched him disappear up the stairs, then sat alone in the kitchen of a house that was slowly, carefully letting her in. Through the window, she could see the barn and the outline of mountains against the stars, and she thought about how strange life was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her had led her exactly where she needed to be, even if she didn't fully understand why yet. She extinguished the lamp and climbed the stairs to the sewing room that smelled like lavender and possibility. Tomorrow she'd clear more garden rows and wash more clothes and prove herself useful one small task at a time. Tonight, she'd let herself believe that maybe surviving was the same thing as beginning to live. In the room across the hall, Evan slept peacefully for the first time in months. And down the hall, Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if bringing a stranger into his broken house was an act of desperation or the first smart decision he'd made since Sarah died. Neither of them had answers yet, but the questions themselves felt like progress. Sunday morning arrived with heat that promised to build into something oppressive by afternoon. Elena woke to the sound of Evan's voice drifting up from the kitchen, talking to his father in the easy way children do when they feel safe. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find them already finishing breakfast. Caleb must have managed coffee and eggs on his own rather than wake her. You should have called me, Elena said, feeling oddly guilty for sleeping past dawn. It's Sunday. Caleb was cleaning his plate at the basin. Even housekeepers get one morning to rest. Can we go to the creek now? Evan bounced in his chair with barely contained energy. Before it gets too hot? I want to show Elena the fishing spot. Caleb glanced at Elena. If she wants to, it's a fair walk. I'd like that. Elena poured herself coffee from the pot still warm on the stove. Give me 10 minutes to drink this and change into something I can get wet. Evan whooped and ran upstairs to get his fishing pole, leaving the adults in the kitchen with the comfortable silence that had started replacing the careful distance. Caleb pulled on his work gloves, preparing to head out to check the horses before the heat settled in. He's different, Caleb said quietly. Since you came. Lighter, somehow. Children are resilient. They just need permission to be happy again. Maybe. Caleb paused at the door. But I think it's more than that. I think he needed to see that life could have new things in it, not just memories of old things lost. He left before Elena could respond, and she stood holding her coffee cup, wondering if he'd been talking about Evan or himself. The walk to the creek took them through a stand of cottonwoods that provided blessed shade from the climbing sun. Evan led the way with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times, pointing out landmarks, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the tree where an owl nested, the place where he'd once seen a fox with kits. "Mom and I used to come here every Sunday in summer," Evan said, scrambling over rocks with the ease of a mountain goat. "She'd bring lunch and we'd stay all afternoon, and sometimes Pa came too, but mostly it was just us." Elena followed more carefully, her city shoes not made for this terrain. "What did you and your mama talk about?" "Everything. She told me about when she was little in Missouri, and about how she met Pa at a church social, and how they came west together when people said it was crazy to leave everything behind." Evan stopped at a bend in the creek where the water pooled deep and clear. "This is it. This is the best spot." The creek was beautiful in a way that made Elena's chest ache. Cold water running over smooth stones, willows trailing their branches in the current, the whole world reduced to the sound of water and wind through leaves. She could understand why Sarah had loved this place, why Evan had held it sacred. "Your mama had good taste," Elena said, settling on a flat rock near the water's edge. Evan grinned and began threading a worm onto his hook with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been taught well. "She said the creek was where she came to think. When things got hard or confusing, she'd come here and the water would help her figure stuff out." "Did it work?" "I think so. She always seemed calmer after." Evan cast his line with a flick that sent the hook exactly where he wanted it. "Do you have a place like that? Where you go to think?" Elena considered the question while watching the water flow past. "I used to walk along the river in Philadelphia, but it wasn't peaceful like this. Too many people, too much noise. I'd go there to feel less alone more than to think." "Are you lonely here?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "Sometimes, but it's different than city lonely. There, I was surrounded by people and still felt invisible. Here, I feel noticed, like I matter, even if I'm still figuring out how." Evan nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to him. They sat in companionable silence, the boy focused on his fishing line and Elena letting her thoughts drift with the current. She found herself thinking about the 2 weeks she'd been given, how 8 days had already passed and she'd fallen into rhythms that felt dangerously close to belonging. "Got one!" Evan's shout shattered the peace as his pole bent nearly double. Elena jumped up to help, but the boy had already mastered the technique, playing the fish with skill that spoke of countless hours of practice. When he finally pulled it from the water, a trout that flashed silver in the sunlight, his face glowed with pride. "Mama taught me how to do it gentle so I don't hurt them more than necessary," Evan explained, carefully removing the hook. "We'll bring this back for dinner. Pa loves fresh trout." They spent another hour by the creek, Evan catching 2 more fish while Elena waded in the shallows, letting the cold water numb her feet and wash away the accumulated dust of the week. When the sun climbed too high to ignore, they packed up and headed back toward the ranch, Evan chattering about fishing techniques and his mother's secret recipe for cornmeal batter. They crested the last hill before the house and stopped short. 2 horses stood tied to the porch rail, expensive animals with fine tack that didn't belong to anyone Elena had met in Stillwater. Caleb stood near the barn talking to 2 men in suits, his posture rigid in a way that suggested trouble. "Who's that?" Elena asked. Evan squinted against the sun. "Don't know. Pa looks mad, though." They approached cautiously, and as they drew closer, Elena could hear raised voices carrying on the still air. "Telling you the contract was clear," one of the men was saying, tall and thin with a voice like oil on water. "The money was paid, arrangements were made. You can't just harbor her here and pretend there are no legal obligations." Elena's blood went cold. She knew that voice, even though she'd never heard it except in her nightmares. The voice of Thomas Whitmore. Except that wasn't his real name, was it? The station master had said these men used false identities, preyed on desperate women, disappeared when convenient. "There's no legal anything," Caleb said flatly. "She paid money to a fraud. That doesn't create obligation, it creates theft." The second man stepped forward, older, with silver hair and a smile that never touched his eyes. "Mr. Morgan, I think you misunderstand. My associate, Mr. Hale here, had a legitimate arrangement with Miss Parker. She agreed to come west as his intended bride. Money changed hands. Promises were made. Victor Hale, Elena said, the name bitter on her tongue. She stepped forward, forcing herself to meet those cold eyes. So Thomas Whitmore was just one of your many aliases? Victor Hale's smile widened. A simple misunderstanding about names hardly invalidates a contract, Miss Parker. You agreed to marry me. You took my money for passage. And now you're living here in sin with another man rather than honoring your commitment. That's breach of contract at best, theft and moral turpitude at worst. I didn't agree to marry you because you don't exist, Elena shot back, fear turning to anger in her veins. You lied about your name, you lied about this town, you probably lied about everything, and I don't owe anything to a lie. The law might see it differently. The thin man pulled papers from his jacket. We have correspondence, proof of payment, evidence of agreement. A judge would be very interested in a woman who takes money under false pretenses and then shacks up with the first man who offers her shelter. Evan had gone very still beside Elena, and she could feel him trembling. Caleb's jaw worked like he was physically restraining himself from violence. Get off my property, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Morgan. Victor's tone dripped with false reasonableness. We're simply here to collect what belongs to me. Miss Parker can come peacefully, honor her agreement, and we'll forget this unfortunate detour, or we can involve the sheriff, the courts, and make this very difficult for everyone involved. She doesn't belong to you or anyone else. Caleb moved to stand beside Elena, a wall of muscle and fury barely contained. And if you think you can come onto my land and make threats, no threats, just facts. Miss Victor straightened his jacket. We'll give you until tomorrow to consider your options, Miss Parker. Either you come with us and fulfill your contract, or we take legal action that will ruin what little reputation you have left. Your choice. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy and mounted his horse, the thin man following suit. They rode away at a leisurely pace, like men who had all the time in the world and knew it. The silence they left behind felt like the aftermath of a storm. Elena couldn't seem to make her lungs work properly. Evan had wrapped himself around her waist, holding on like she might vanish if he let go. Caleb stood motionless, staring at the dust settling in the wake of the horses, his hands clenched into fists. They can't really make you go, can they? Evan's voice was small and terrified. Tell her they can't, Pa. They can't, but Caleb's voice lacked the certainty Elena needed to hear. This is extortion, pure and simple. Extortion with paperwork. Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. I signed letters. I sent money. A lawyer could twist that into looking like a binding agreement. Then we'll get our own lawyer. Fight this properly. With what money? I have $6 and you're barely keeping this ranch afloat. Elena pulled Evan's arms gently loose and knelt to look at him. Go inside, sweetheart. Your pa and I need to talk. But now, Evan. Caleb's tone left no room for argument. The boy went, looking back every few steps like he expected Elena to disappear before he reached the door. When it closed behind him, the silence returned, heavier than before. Why didn't you tell me? Caleb's voice was tight with something that might have been anger or fear. That the man had your signature on letters? That money had changed hands? Because I thought he'd just disappear like all frauds do when their schemes fall apart. I didn't think he'd actually come here and try to... Elena's hands were shaking. I didn't think he'd want me badly enough to fight for it. This isn't about wanting you. This is about control and money. Caleb finally looked at her, his gray eyes dark with understanding. Men like that don't chase women across territories for love or even lust. They do it because they can't stand losing what they think they own. I'm not property to be owned. I know that, but the law is murky on women's rights, especially when there's signed correspondence and evidence of financial transaction. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustration radiating from every line of his body. We need to talk to the sheriff, see what legal standing he actually has. They rode into town an hour later, leaving Evan with Mrs. Brennan, who took one look at their faces and asked no questions. The sheriff's office sat behind the general store, a small building that smelled of tobacco and old paper. Sheriff Tom Hastings was a man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen most of what humanity had to offer, good and bad. He listened to their story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and sighed. "This is a mess," he said bluntly. "Legally speaking, Hale has a case. Maybe not a strong one, but enough to cause serious trouble. The signed letters could be interpreted as a contract of intent to marry, and the money you sent could be seen as acceptance of terms." Elena felt the floor drop out from under her. "So he can force me to marry him?" "No, but he can tie you up in court, ruin your reputation beyond repair, and possibly get a judgment against you for the money plus damages." Hastings tapped his pencil against the desk. "Or he could have you arrested for theft and fraud, which would mean jail time while it gets sorted out." "That's insane," Caleb said. "She's the victim here."
You and I know that, but proving it in court with a skilled lawyer on the other side, that's a different matter. Hastings leaned forward. "Here's what I think is really happening. Hale is a con man, that much is clear. But he's not stupid. He knows he can't actually marry you against your will or win a real court case. What he's banking on is that the threat alone will be enough to make you comply out of fear, or that Morgan here will pay him to go away quietly." "I'm not paying him anything," Caleb said flatly. "Then we need another strategy." Hastings pulled out a ledger. "Let me ask around, see if anyone else has had dealings with Hale or his associate. Con men usually work the same territory multiple times. If we can find other victims, build a pattern of fraud, we might have grounds to arrest him instead." It was something, but it wasn't enough. As they left the sheriff's office, Elena felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. Go with Victor Hale and submit to a marriage that was legal slavery, or fight and risk destroying not just her own life, but Caleb's and Evan's as well, when the scandal and legal battles drove away what little stability they'd built. "I should leave," Elena said as they walked back toward Mrs. Brennan's to collect Evan. "Just disappear. Go somewhere else and start over before this gets worse." Caleb stopped so abruptly she almost ran into him. "No. If I'm gone, there's nothing for them to fight over. You and Evan can what? Go back to barely surviving? Pretend the last 10 days didn't happen?" Caleb's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Evan has smiled more in the past week than he has in 2 years. The house feels alive again. And you think the answer is to just vanish like you don't matter? I don't want to bring trouble to your family." "You didn't bring trouble. Trouble found you, and now we're going to deal with it." He started walking again, his stride determined. "Together. Because that's what people do when they've made commitments to each other, even temporary ones." Elena hurried to keep up, something warm and dangerous unfurling in her chest. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me." "Because it's right. Because Evan needs you. Because—" He stopped again, turning to face her on the dusty street, with the afternoon sun beating down on both of them. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have no one care enough to help. And I won't do that to someone else, not when I have the power to stand with them." Before Elena could respond, Mrs. Brennan emerged from the general store with Evan in tow. The boy's face lit up when he saw them, then immediately clouded with worry. "Did the sheriff fix it? Are the bad men going away?" "We're working on it," Caleb said, ruffling his son's hair. "But it might take some time." "They can't have Elena." Evan's voice carried the fierce certainty of a child who'd already lost too much. "We won't let them." On the ride back to the ranch, Elena kept replaying Caleb's words in her mind. "I won't do that to someone else. Not I'm helping you. Not. It's my Christian duty. But I won't do that, like her pain was his pain, like her fight was his fight." It terrified her how much that mattered. That night, after Evan was asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Elena found Caleb on the porch, staring out at the darkness. She'd meant to go straight to bed, to avoid the intimacy of late-night conversations that made her forget all the reasons she needed to keep her heart locked away. But her feet carried her outside anyway. "Can't sleep?" she asked. Thinking. He didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the horizon. About Sarah. About how when she got sick, I couldn't do anything to save her. I had to just watch her slip away while feeling completely powerless. Elena sat on the porch step, giving him space. "This isn't the same thing." "Isn't it? He stopped, corrected himself. "Someone under my protection is being threatened, and I can't just make it go away by wanting it hard enough." "You're not powerless, Caleb. You're standing with me. That's not nothing." He finally looked at her, his face half shadow in the moonlight. What if standing isn't enough? What if they take you anyway? Then I'll keep fighting, the way you taught me to, by not giving up on a broken ranch and a grieving child. Elena stood, moving to the porch rail beside him. You said Evan needed to see that life could have new things in it. Maybe you need to see that too, that fighting doesn't always end in loss. You don't know that it won't. No, but I know that giving up guarantees it will. She turned to face him fully. I'm not Sarah. I'm not going to slip away quietly while you watch helpless.
If Victor Hale wants to destroy me, he's going to have to work for it, and I'm going to make him regret every step. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, respect and something deeper, something that made Elena's breath catch. You're nothing like I expected when you stepped off that train. What did you expect? Someone broken, someone who'd need saving. He smiled, barely. Turns out you're the one doing the saving around here. Before Elena could process that, before she could examine the warmth spreading through her chest or the dangerous hope taking root in her heart, a sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of the road. Caleb tensed immediately, his hand moving to the rifle he kept near the door. A horse burst into the yard, and Mrs. Brennan's voice called out, "Caleb! Elena! Wake up!" They rushed down the steps as Mrs. Brennan dismounted, breathing hard. "The sheriff sent me. He found something. 2 other women in the county who had dealings with Victor Hale under different names. One of them is willing to testify." "When?" Caleb demanded. "Tomorrow. He's calling an emergency hearing with the territorial judge who's passing through. If we can prove a pattern of fraud, he can issue a warrant for Hale's arrest before they make good on any threats." Mrs. Brennan looked at Elena. "But you need to be prepared. You'll have to testify. Tell everything. It won't be pleasant." Elena thought about standing in front of a judge and a room full of strangers laying bare her desperation and foolishness for everyone to examine. She thought about Victor Hale's cold eyes and oily voice, about the threat he represented not just to her, but to everything she was building here. And she thought about Evan sleeping upstairs, about Caleb standing beside her in the darkness, about the garden rows she'd cleared and the meals she'd cooked and the life that was finally, tentatively, beginning to feel like it might be hers. "I'll do it," she said, "whatever it takes." Mrs. Brennan nodded with grim satisfaction. "Then we'd better get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be one hell of a day." After Mrs. Brennan rode back toward town, Elena stood in the yard watching the dust settle in the moonlight. The weight of tomorrow pressed against her chest like a physical thing, making it hard to draw full breath. Behind her she heard Caleb's boots on the porch steps. "You should try to rest," he said quietly. "I should do a lot of things." Elena turned to face him. "But sleeping while knowing I have to stand in front of a judge and admit how foolish I was, that's not happening tonight." "You weren't foolish. You were desperate. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because right now it feels like the same thing." She wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill. "I let myself believe a stranger's letters because I wanted so badly for them to be true. That's not desperation. That's willful blindness." Caleb moved closer, and in the darkness his face was all shadows and sharp angles. "You want to know what I think? I think you were brave. It takes courage to risk everything on hope when you've got nothing left to lose. Foolish people stay in bad situations because they're afraid. Brave people take chances even when the odds are terrible. And look where my bravery got me. Threatened, trapped, about to be dissected in a courtroom for everyone's entertainment. No." His voice carried an edge of steel. "Your bravery got you here, to a place where people are willing to fight for you. That's not nothing, Elena." She wanted to believe him, wanted to feel the certainty he projected, but fear had its claws too deep in her chest. What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if Victor is more convincing, or the other women back out, or... Then we'll figure out the next step, together. Caleb reached out like he might touch her arm, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand fall. "You're not alone in this. I need you to understand that." The words settled between them with a weight that had nothing to do with the trial. Elena looked at this man who'd been a stranger less than 2 weeks ago and wondered when exactly he'd become the person she most wanted beside her when everything fell apart. "Why?" she asked.
Why does it matter to you what happens to me? The silence stretched long enough that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been honesty or might have been pain. Because watching you fight reminded me I'm not dead yet either. Because Evan laughs now, and the house smells like bread again, and for the first time since Sarah died, I can imagine tomorrow without feeling like I'm drowning. He met her eyes directly. Because you matter, Elena. And I'm tired of losing people who matter. Before she could respond, before she could examine what that confession meant, or what she wanted it to mean, a cry split the night. Evan's voice, high and terrified, calling for his father. They both ran for the house, taking the stairs 2 at a time to reach the boy's room. Evan sat bolt upright in bed, his face wet with tears, trembling so hard the whole bed shook. Caleb was there first, gathering his son against his chest and murmuring the low, steady words fathers use to chase away nightmares. But Evan's eyes found Elena in the doorway. "They took you," he sobbed. "The bad men came and took you away, and you didn't come back, and Pa said you were gone forever like Mama. I'm here, sweetheart." Elena moved to the bed, kneeling beside Caleb so Evan could see her face clearly. "I'm right here. It was just a dream." "But tomorrow," Evan hiccuped through his tears, "tomorrow they're going to try to make you leave for real. I heard Mrs. Brennan talking. There's going to be a trial and judges and I'm going to fight," Elena finished firmly. "I'm going to tell the truth, and we're going to make sure those bad men can't hurt anyone else. But I'm not going to disappear, Evan. I promise." "You can't promise that." The boy's voice cracked. "Mama promised she'd get better, and she didn't. People leave even when they promise they won't." The raw grief in those words hit Elena like a fist to the sternum. She glanced at Caleb and saw her own pain reflected in his face, the helplessness of trying to make guarantees when the world had already proven that nothing was certain. "You're right," Elena said slowly. "I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that I'm going to fight with everything I have to stay. And your pa is going to fight. And the sheriff and Mrs. Brennan and everyone who knows the truth is going to fight. Sometimes that's all we can do, fight for what matters and hope it's enough." Evan looked between them with eyes too old for his young face. "What if it's not enough?" "Then we'll figure out what comes next." Caleb's voice was steady, even though his hands weren't. "But we're not going to borrow tomorrow's troubles tonight. Right now, Elena is here. We're all here together. That's what we're going to hold on to." They sat with Evan until he finally fell back into restless sleep, Elena on one side of the bed and Caleb on the other, forming a wall of protection around the boy who'd already lost too much. When his breathing finally evened out, they crept from the room, leaving the door cracked so they'd hear if he woke again. In the hallway, lit only by the lamp Elena had brought upstairs, they stood close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of Caleb's face. "He's terrified," Caleb said quietly, "and I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix it. You can only be there while he's scared." Elena set the lamp on the small table against the wall. "That's what my mother did when I was afraid. She didn't promise everything would be fine. She just sat with me in the fear until it got smaller." "Is that what you need? Someone to sit with you in the fear?" The question was so gentle it nearly broke her. "I don't know what I need anymore. I just know I can't run. Not from Victor Hale, not from the trial, not from whatever happens after." Caleb reached out, and this time he didn't stop himself. His hand closed around hers, warm and calloused and solid. "Then we'll stand. Together." They stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped in the lamplight, 2 damaged people holding on to each other in the darkness. Then Elena gently pulled away because the touch felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure, and she couldn't afford to need anyone this much when tomorrow might take everything away. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of courtrooms and cold eyes and hands pulling her away from a house that had started to feel like home. When dawn finally came, Elena was already dressed, her best clothes pressed as well as she could manage, her hair pinned with the kind of severe practicality that suggested respectability, even if she didn't feel it. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came down, making coffee with the focused intensity of someone who needed the ritual more than the caffeine. Evan sat at the table, unusually quiet, pushing biscuits around his plate without eating. "You look nice," Evan said softly.
Thank you. Elena sat beside him. Are you going to be all right staying with Mrs. Brennan today? I want to come with you, to the trial. No. Caleb's voice was absolute. This isn't something for children to witness. But I want to help Elena. You help by trusting us to handle this. Caleb set coffee in front of Elena with hands that were almost steady. And by being brave while you wait. Can you do that? Evan's lip trembled, but he nodded. Will you tell me everything after? Even the bad parts? The parts you need to know, Elena promised. But yes, we'll tell you the truth. Mrs. Brennan arrived as the sun was climbing higher, driving a wagon that could fit all of them for the ride to town. She took one look at Elena's pale face and pressed a flask into her hands. Whiskey, just a sip. It'll settle your nerves. I need my head clear. You need to stop shaking long enough to walk into that courthouse. Mrs. Brennan's tone was firm but kind. One sip. Consider it medicinal. Elena drank and felt the burn chase away some of the ice in her veins. They loaded into the wagon, Caleb and Elena in the back, Evan wedged between Mrs. Brennan and her husband who'd come to drive. The ride to town felt both endless and too short, every turn of the wheels bringing them closer to a reckoning Elena wasn't sure she was ready to face. Stillwater's small courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread fast, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to witness the spectacle. Elena saw Lucy Hartwell near the front, her expression hungry for drama. The shopkeepers, the ranchers, families she recognized from the church meeting, all of them watching as she climbed down from the wagon with Caleb's steadying hand on her elbow. Sheriff Hastings met them at the door. The judge is already inside. Territorial Judge Samuel Morrison. Fair man, but he doesn't suffer fools or liars. Tell the truth plainly and you'll do fine. What about Hale? Caleb asked. Already here with his lawyer, man from Cheyenne, all polish and no scruples from what I can tell. Hastings looked at Elena. Are you ready? No, Elena thought, but she nodded anyway because, ready or not, this was happening. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined, with wooden benches packed with spectators and a raised platform where Judge Morrison sat like an Old Testament prophet, white-haired and stern-faced, radiating the kind of authority that made people think twice before lying. Victor Hale sat at a table with his lawyer looking perfectly composed in an expensive suit. His eyes found Elena, and something cold moved behind them, a shark's recognition of prey. Elena took her seat beside Caleb and the lawyer Hastings had found for them, a young man named Daniel Walsh, who looked barely old enough to shave, but spoke with surprising confidence when he leaned over to whisper instructions. Let them go first. Let Hale lay out his story. Then we dismantle it piece by piece. Judge Morrison rapped his gavel, and the room fell silent. This is an emergency hearing in the matter of Victor Hale versus Elena Parker, with additional testimonies regarding patterns of fraud. Mr. Hale, you brought this complaint. State your case. Hale's lawyer stood smooth as oil. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of contract enforcement. My client, operating under the business name Thomas Whitmore, entered into a correspondence with Miss Parker regarding marriage. Terms were agreed upon, money was exchanged for travel expenses, and Miss Parker accepted those terms by traveling west. Upon arrival, instead of honoring her commitment, she took up residence with another man and has refused to fulfill her obligations. We're seeking either enforcement of the marriage contract or restitution of funds plus damages. The words made it sound so reasonable, so clean, like Elena had simply changed her mind about a business transaction instead of fleeing a trap. Miss Parker, the judge said, his eyes moving to her, how do you respond? Elena stood on legs that wanted to shake but didn't. Your Honor, I was deceived. The man who called himself Thomas Whitmore promised marriage, yes, but he lied about his identity, his location, and his intentions. When I arrived in Stillwater, no one had heard of him. I was stranded with no money and no prospects until Mr. Morgan offered me honest work. I didn't breach a contract. I escaped a fraud. She took my client's money under false pretenses, the lawyer countered. That makes her the fraud, not him. I took money I believed was for legitimate travel expenses to meet my intended husband. When I discovered he didn't exist, I looked for work to support myself. That's not fraud. That's survival. Judge Morrison held up a hand. I've heard enough preliminary statements. Let's see the evidence. Mr. Hale, present your case. What followed was an exercise in watching the truth get twisted. Hale's lawyer presented the letters Elena had sent, letters that in hindsight looked naive and desperate, full of hope for a better life and gratitude for the opportunity. He showed receipts for the money she'd sent, her signature on each transaction. He painted a picture of a woman who'd made promises and then abandoned them the moment something better came along. She saw an opportunity with Mr. Morgan, a prosperous rancher, a widower in need of comfort, and she took it without regard for the obligations she'd already incurred. Elena's hands clenched in her lap. Caleb's shoulder pressed against hers, solid and steady. Then it was Walsh's turn, and he stood with the kind of quiet confidence that made Elena think maybe Hastings had chosen well. Your Honor, I'd like to call Miss Parker to testify. Elena made her way to the witness stand on legs that felt like water. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, and when she sat down, she could feel every eye in the room boring into her. Walsh began gently. Miss Parker, tell us why you left Philadelphia. I was working as a seamstress, barely making enough to survive. The work was brutal, the pay was worse, and the opportunities for women alone were... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Limited and often degrading. I wanted a chance at something better. And when Mr. Whitmore, or rather Mr. Hale, wrote to you, what did he promise? A partnership, a ranch in need of a woman's touch. He said he was looking for someone sensible and hardworking, not a society lady. He made it sound like we'd be building something together, equals working toward a common future. Did he ask you for money? Yes, for travel expenses and household necessities. He said it would be easier if I brought things with me rather than trying to source them after arrival. And did you believe him? Elena met Walsh's eyes. I wanted to believe him. I was desperate enough that I ignored the parts that didn't quite make sense. That's on me. But wanting something badly enough doesn't mean I deserve to be lied to. Walsh nodded and pulled out a folder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence testimonies from 2 other women who had similar experiences with the defendant. Both were contacted by a man using different names, both sent money, both arrived to find no one waiting. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison rapped his gavel for silence as Walsh presented the documents. Elena watched Victor Hale's face and saw the first crack in his composure, a tightening around his eyes, a tension in his jaw. These women, Walsh continued, traveled to different territories under similar circumstances. One to Colorado, one to Montana. The man used different names but the same methods, and in both cases, when the women arrived with no one to meet them, he appeared days later claiming the delay was their fault and demanding either marriage or return of funds with interest. Objection, Hale's lawyer stood. These are unrelated cases with no proven connection to my client. I can prove the connection, Walsh said calmly. All 3 women received letters written on the same type of stationery, posted from the same city, Cheyenne, despite claims of residence in 3 different territories. The handwriting analysis shows consistent patterns across all correspondence, and most damningly, all 3 women describe the same man, tall, silver hair, cold eyes, with a thin associate who handles the legal threats. He gestured to where Hale's assistant sat in the gallery, and the thin man shifted uncomfortably under the sudden scrutiny. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Hale, would you care to explain these coincidences? Hale stood, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place. Your Honor, I'm a businessman. I've helped facilitate marriages for several women seeking opportunities in the West. If some of those arrangements didn't work out due to the women's cold feet or unrealistic expectations, that's unfortunate but not criminal. You call it business. The law calls it fraud. Walsh's voice was sharp. You deliberately misrepresent yourself, collect money from vulnerable women, and then either extort them into marriages they don't want or sue them for funds you obtained through deception. That's not business, Mr. Hale. That's predatory behavior with a veneer of legality. I demand proof of these accusations, Hale's lawyer interjected. Then let's provide it. Walsh turned to the judge. I'd like to call Mrs. Catherine Reynolds to the stand. A woman in her 30s stood from the gallery, her face pale but determined. As she made her way to the witness stand, Elena saw the same desperation she'd carried, the same hope that had been weaponized against her. Catherine Reynolds told her story in a voice that shook but didn't break. How she'd been widowed with a child, how the letters had promised security and partnership, how she'd sent money and traveled to Colorado only to find nothing. How Victor Hale had appeared 3 days later, claiming she'd misunderstood the arrangements and offering marriage on terms that amounted to indentured servitude or legal action that would leave her destitute. "I paid him," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "I gave him everything I had left just to make him go away. I was terrified and alone, and I didn't know what else to do." "Did you get your money back after you paid?" "No. He said it was payment for the trouble I'd caused him by not following through on our agreement." Walsh let that sit for a moment before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a pattern, a deliberate, calculated pattern of targeting desperate women and exploiting their vulnerability for financial gain. Miss Parker is the first one brave enough to fight back instead of quietly paying to make the problem disappear." The courtroom had gone silent, the earlier whispers replaced by something heavier. Elena saw faces in the crowd shifting from judgment to understanding, from speculation to outrage. Even Lucy Hartwell looked shaken, her earlier hunger for scandal replaced by something that might have been sympathy. Judge Morrison's expression had gone from stern to thunderous. "Mr. Hale, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Hale stood again, and this time his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your Honor, business sometimes involves disappointed parties. That doesn't make it criminal. I've broken no laws." "Haven't you?" The judge's voice was ice. "Fraud, extortion, operating under false identities, those sound like laws to me. Sheriff Hastings, do you have those warrants I requested?" Hastings stepped forward with papers in hand. "Yes, Your Honor. Warrants for Victor Hale and his associate Martin Crew on charges of fraud and extortion." The courtroom exploded. Hale's lawyer was on his feet shouting objections. People in the gallery were talking over each other, and Hale himself had gone very still, his mask finally slipping to reveal the cold rage beneath. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." When silence finally returned, the judge's voice carried the weight of final judgment. "Victor Hale, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest. You will be held pending trial on charges of fraud, extortion, and obtaining money under false pretenses. All claims against Miss Parker are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I'm ordering restitution be paid to Miss Parker and Mrs. Reynolds from any assets you possess." "You can't do this," Hale snarled, the veneer of civility completely gone. "I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. Sheriff, take him into custody." What happened next moved too fast for Elena to process. Hastings moved toward Hale with handcuffs ready. Hale's thin associate bolted for the door, and Hale himself lunged not toward the exit, but toward Elena, his face twisted with fury. "You ruined everything," he spat. "Stupid, desperate little—" Caleb was there before Hale could finish, intercepting him with a shoulder that sent the older man sprawling. Hastings was on Hale in seconds, wrestling his arms behind his back, while the thin man was caught at the door by two ranchers who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of chaos. Elena sat frozen in the witness stand, watching justice happen in real time. Catherine Reynolds was crying silently in her seat. Mrs. Brennan had appeared beside Elena, one hand on her shoulder, murmuring that it was over. It was really over. Judge Morrison waited until both men were restrained before speaking again. "Let the record show that the defendant demonstrated violent intent toward the plaintiff, further supporting the charges against him. This hearing is concluded. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell for the final time, and Elena felt something break loose in her chest. Fear or relief, or maybe both at once. Caleb was suddenly there, helping her down from the witness stand, his hands steady even though hers were shaking so hard she could barely stand. "It's done," he said quietly. "You're safe." Around them, the courtroom was chaos. People congratulating Walsh, surrounding Catherine Reynolds with support, watching as Hale and his associate were led away in chains. But in the small space between Elena and Caleb, there was only stillness and the weight of what they'd just survived together. Mrs. Brennan materialized with Evan, who'd apparently sneaked in during the commotion. The boy threw himself at Elena with enough force to nearly knock her over. You won! You made the bad men go away! We won, Elena corrected, holding him tight. All of us together.
Outside the courthouse, Stillwater citizens lingered in the summer heat, and Elena realized something had shifted. The look she received now carried respect instead of speculation, sympathy instead of judgment. Lucy Hartwell actually approached her, something like shame on her pretty face. Miss Parker, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your character when I should have. Well, I'm sorry. Elena studied the woman who'd seen her as competition and found only another person trying to survive in a world that didn't make things easy for women alone. Apology accepted, Mrs. Hartwell. We all make mistakes when we're afraid. As they loaded into the wagon for the ride home, Elena felt the last of the fear drain away, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Evan sat between her and Caleb, chattering excitedly about how the judge had been like something from a storybook, and how the bad men had looked scared when the sheriff put on the handcuffs. Caleb caught her eye over the boy's head, and in that look was everything they hadn't said, relief and gratitude and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name yet. But it was there, real and growing, like the tomato plants they'd rescued from the garden, something that had survived against odds and was determined to thrive. The ranch appeared over the final hill, and for the first time since arriving in Stillwater, Elena looked at it and felt only welcome. The house with its peeling paint, the garden with its cleared rows, the barn where horses waited to be fed, all of it felt like it might actually become hers, not through marriage or obligation, but through choice and work and the kind of belonging that had to be earned. What happens now? Evan asked as they pulled into the yard. Elena looked at Caleb, then at the boy whose nightmares had been about losing her, then at the land stretching away under the endless Wyoming sky. Now we live, she said simply. We keep working, keep growing, keep building something worth protecting. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't a fairy tale ending, but standing there in the summer heat with the trial behind them and the future uncertain and terrifying and possible all at once, it felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like the beginning of something real. The days after the trial passed in a strange blur of normalcy that felt almost foreign after so much upheaval. Elena woke each morning half expecting to find it had all been a dream. The courtroom, the victory, the way Caleb had moved to protect her without hesitation. But the ranch was real, solid under her feet, and the work waiting was as tangible as the calluses forming on her palms. 2 weeks became 3, then 4, and nobody mentioned the trial period anymore. It simply evaporated like morning dew under the Wyoming sun, replaced by rhythms that felt less like temporary arrangement and more like permanent belonging. Elena planted the rest of the garden in neat rows that Sarah would have recognized, coaxed life back into beds that had gone wild with neglect. Tomatoes climbed their stakes, beans wound around poles, squash sprawled across carefully mounded earth. Each green shoot felt like proof that broken things could heal if given enough care and time. Evan shadowed her through the work, his questions endless and earnest. How deep should the holes be? Why did some plants need more water than others? Did she think his mama would be proud of how the garden looked now? That last question came on a morning 3 weeks after the trial, his small hands covered in soil, his face so hopeful it made Elena's chest ache. I think, Elena said carefully, sitting back on her heels to look at him properly, that your mama would be proud of you for being brave enough to keep loving things even after losing her, for helping make this place beautiful again. Are you going to leave when the garden's all done? The question landed like a stone in still water. Elena had been waiting for it, dreading it, because she didn't have a simple answer. The 2-week agreement was long past. Victor Hale was in jail awaiting trial in Cheyenne, his assets being liquidated to pay restitution. Sheriff Hastings had sent word that Elena would receive her $45 back plus damages, though the money felt less important now than it had when she'd first stepped off that train. I don't have anywhere else to go, Elena said, which was truth, but not the whole truth. But do you want to stay? That's different than not having somewhere else. Sometimes children saw through adult evasions with clarity that was uncomfortable. Elena pulled off her work gloves and really looked at this boy who'd mistaken her for his mother and then loved her anyway when she turned out to be just herself. Yes, she said. I want to stay. If your pa thinks it's all right. Pa wants you to stay too, I can tell. How can you tell? He smiles now, not big smiles, but little ones when he thinks nobody's watching, and he doesn't look so tired all the time. Evan pulled a weed with the intensity of someone doing important work. Plus he fixed the porch swing yesterday, the one Mama liked. He hasn't touched it since she died, but yesterday he just went out there and fixed it like it was normal. Elena hadn't noticed the porch swing. She made a mental note to sit on it later to test whether Caleb's repairs were as solid as everything else he built. That evening, after Evan was asleep and the dishes were clean and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Elena found Caleb on that same porch, sitting on the newly repaired swing with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. The chains creaked softly as the swing moved, a peaceful sound that belonged to summer evenings and lives that had room for small comforts. Evan says you fixed this, Elena said from the doorway. Caleb looked up, startled, like he'd been somewhere far away in his thoughts. It needed doing. Been meaning to get to it for... He stopped, the lie too obvious to complete. 2 years. I've been meaning to get to it for 2 years. Can I sit? He shifted over without a word, and Elena settled beside him on the swing that Sarah had loved. They sat in silence, the evening air carrying the scent of the garden and the distant sound of horses settling for the night. Lightning bugs drifted through the darkness like fallen stars, and somewhere a whippoorwill called its lonely song. The money came through, Caleb said finally, from Hale's restitution. Hastings brought it by while you were in town with Evan this afternoon. Elena's hands tightened in her lap. $45. The same amount she'd sent in hope and desperation, now returned like a cosmic joke. That's good. It's enough to get you somewhere else if you want. A ticket back east, or to California, or wherever you want to start fresh without... He gestured vaguely at the ranch, at himself, at the complicated situation they'd built. Without all this, the offer sat between them, genuine and terrible. Elena felt the weight of choice pressing down on her shoulders. The freedom to leave now that Victor Hale couldn't chase her, the money to go anywhere and become anyone. She could walk away from this broken ranch and its broken family and find something easier, something that didn't come with grief woven into the foundation. Is that what you want? She asked quietly. For me to go? No. The word came fast, almost desperate, before Caleb seemed to catch himself. But what I want doesn't matter. You never asked to be tied to this place. You were running from one trap, and I don't want to be another one. Elena turned to face him in the darkness, seeing his profile against the star-scattered sky. You think staying here would be a trap? I think you deserve better than settling because you've got nowhere else to go. And I think, Elena said with more force than she'd intended, that you don't get to decide what I deserve. Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I'm tired of surviving hand to mouth in cities where nobody knows my name or cares if I disappear. Maybe I want to build something that matters, with people who matter, in a place that feels like it could actually become home. Caleb was very still. The swing stopped mid-sway. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Elena took a breath, steadying herself for honesty that felt dangerous. I know this isn't what either of us planned. I know you're still grieving Sarah and probably always will be. I know Evan needs stability more than he needs another person who might leave. But I also know that for the first time since I was 12 years old, I wake up and feel like I'm building something instead of just surviving it. That means something to me. It means everything. The silence stretched long enough that Elena wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too much of the hope she'd been carefully guarding. Then Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers calloused and warm and steady. I can't offer you romance, he said quietly. I can't promise I'll ever stop missing Sarah or comparing everything to how it was before. I can't even promise I'll be easy to live with. But I can promise honest work, fair treatment, and a home for as long as you want one. That's more than I had when I stepped off that train. It should be more than that. You should have... He stopped, struggling with words. You should have someone who can give you everything, not just stability and a roof. Elena squeezed his hand. Maybe I don't need everything. Maybe I just need enough.
A place to belong, work that matters, people who see me as more than just another pair of hands. That's enough, Caleb. He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand like he wasn't quite aware he was doing it. Evan asked me yesterday if you were going to be his new mama. What did you tell him? That it didn't work like that. That you were Elena, not a replacement for Sarah. Caleb's voice was rough. But then he said something that's been eating at me. He said maybe having Elena was better than having a replacement because you were choosing to be here instead of being stuck here by birth or marriage. He said that made it more real somehow. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. He's a smart boy. Too smart sometimes. Makes it hard to hide from the truth. Caleb finally looked at her, his face shadowed but his eyes catching starlight. The truth is that this place has felt more like a home in the last month than it has in 2 years. The truth is that Evan laughs again, and I can breathe again, and the future doesn't feel like something to just endure anymore. And all of that is because of you. Not just me, because we all chose to try, to fight for something better than what we had. Then keep choosing it. His hand tightened on hers. Stay, Elena. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to be here. Help me raise my son and keep this ranch alive and build something worth having. I can't offer you a grand passion or a fairy tale, but I can offer you partnership and respect and a family that needs you. It wasn't a proposal. It was something both simpler and more profound, an invitation to stay, to belong, to matter. Elena looked at this man who'd offered her work when she was desperate and protection when she was threatened, and now was offering her something even more precious, choice. Yes, she said, I'll stay. The kiss happened so naturally that later neither of them could say who moved first. It was soft and careful, tentative as first kisses ought to be, carrying the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they were building. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. I can't promise I'll be good at this, he whispered, at letting someone in again. Then we'll learn together. I'm not good at staying either. I've spent my whole life ready to run. Elena touched his face, feeling the scruff of his beard under her palm. But I'm tired of running, Caleb. I'm ready to stand still and see what grows. They sat on the porch swing until the moon rose high, and the night grew cool enough to drive them inside. When they parted at the top of the stairs, Caleb to his room, Elena to hers, it felt less like separation and more like temporary distance before tomorrow brought them back together. The summer slipped into early autumn with the kind of gentle transition that Wyoming sometimes allowed. The garden produced more than they could eat, so Elena started preserving, canning tomatoes and beans, drying herbs, making preserves that would carry them through winter. Caleb worked on the ranch with renewed energy, fixing fences and repairing outbuildings and planning for cattle drives in the spring. Evan started school with new confidence, coming home each day to tell Elena about his lessons and show her his careful lettering. They became a family in small increments, through shared meals and evening conversations and the quiet intimacy of working side by side. Caleb taught Elena to ride, his hand steady on the reins until she found her balance. Elena taught Evan to bake bread, laughing when his first loaf came out dense as brick but edible nonetheless. They fell into patterns, Sunday mornings at the creek, Wednesday evenings on the porch swing, Saturday afternoons in town where people had stopped whispering and started greeting them like they belonged. Mrs. Brennan became a regular visitor, bringing gossip and company in equal measure. Catherine Reynolds stopped by once, traveling through Stillwater on her way to a fresh start in Oregon. She and Elena sat on that porch swing and talked about survival and second chances, and the strange paths that led women to find strength they hadn't known they possessed. You fought back, Catherine said before she left. When I couldn't, that gave me the courage to finally stop running and start building something real. We fought back together, Elena corrected. Your testimony is what convinced the judge. You gave other women the courage to come forward too. Then maybe some good came from all that pain. Catherine hugged her tight. Take care of that family of yours. They're lucky to have you. After she left, Elena stood in the yard and looked at the ranch. No longer broken, no longer drowning in grief, but alive and productive and full of possibility. The house had fresh paint. The garden was bursting with autumn harvest. The barn was sound and the fences were strong, and smoke rose from the chimney in the evenings, carrying the smell of bread and soup and normalcy. Caleb found her there, standing in the golden afternoon light, and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we've come. How different everything is from that first day when Evan called me mama and I didn't know whether to run or stay. I'm glad you stayed." "So am I." Elena leaned back against his chest. "Though I have a question I've been afraid to ask." "Ask it." "When are you going to make this official? We've been courting for 3 months now. People are starting to talk about intentions." She felt him smile against her hair. "I was waiting for the right moment. Didn't want to rush you or make you feel pressured." "Caleb Morgan, I stood in a courtroom and fought for the right to stay here. I think I've made my intentions pretty clear." He turned her in his arms, his gray eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like happiness. "Then I'll ask properly. Elena Parker, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Evan's mother and my partner in this life we're building?" "Yes." The answer came easy as breathing. Yes to all of it. They married in late October when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first hint of coming winter. It was a small ceremony in the church where Elena had first felt the weight of judgment, but now felt only welcome. Mrs. Brennan cried. Evan stood between them as a witness, his face solemn with the importance of the occasion. Sheriff Hastings attended, and half of Stillwater, and even Lucy Hartwell, who'd become something close to a friend after her initial hostility, faded into grudging respect. Elena wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Caleb had insisted on buying, simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes, practical enough for a rancher's wife, but pretty enough for a wedding. Caleb wore his best suit and looked uncomfortable until Elena squeezed his hand and whispered that she'd never seen him more handsome. The minister spoke about partnership and commitment and building lives on foundations of honesty and hard work. When they exchanged vows, Elena felt the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment, leaving Philadelphia, stepping off that train into uncertainty, staying when running would have been easier. Each decision had led her here, to this man and this boy and this life that was harder and better than anything she'd imagined. "I promise to stand with you," she said when it was her turn, "in the good times and the hard times, to build something worth having and to never stop fighting for what matters." Caleb's voice was steady when he made his promises. "I promise to value you as my partner, to honor your strength, and to give you the kind of home where you can be fully yourself. I promise to let you in, even when it's hard, to choose you every day, the way you chose us." When the minister pronounced them married, Evan whooped loud enough to make everyone laugh. And when Caleb kissed his bride, it felt like the seal on a promise already being kept, day by day, choice by choice. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard laden with food the community had brought. Music played, children ran wild, and Elena found herself dancing with her new husband under the autumn sky, while their son, hers now, legally and completely, spun in circles with other children, dizzy with joy. "Happy?" Caleb asked, his arms around her waist as they swayed to fiddle music. "Terrified and happy. Is that allowed?" "I think it's required. Building a life with someone is always terrifying, but doing it anyway is what makes it worth something." They danced until the stars came out and the guests began drifting home, leaving behind good wishes and the promise of community support. Mrs. Brennan was the last to leave, hugging Elena so tight she could barely breathe. "You did good, girl. Built something real out of nothing but grit and hope." "We're still building," Elena said. "There's so much left to do." "That's life, isn't it? Always building, always growing, always becoming something more than we were." Mrs. Brennan smiled. "But you've got a good foundation now. That's more than most people manage." After everyone left, the three of them sat on the porch swing, Elena in the middle, Caleb on one side, Evan on the other, and watched the last of the sunset fade into night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and work. Winter was coming with all its hardships. The ranch would demand everything they had to give and then ask for more. But tonight, they were just a family sitting together in the peace of their own land, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Tell me a story," Evan said sleepily, his head on Elena's shoulder. "What kind of story?" "A true one. About how you got here." Elena exchanged a look with Caleb over their son's head. Once upon a time, there was a woman who was very lost and very alone. She made a desperate choice that turned out to be the wrong choice, and she ended up stranded in a place where nobody knew her name. That's a sad beginning, Evan mumbled. The best stories have sad beginnings. That's how you know the ending will be worth it. Elena kissed the top of his head. So this woman was stranded and scared, but then she met a man and a boy who were lost too, just in different ways. And instead of running from each other, they chose to stand together. They chose to fight for something better than what they had. And slowly, day by day, choice by choice, they built a home. Is that the end? No, sweetheart. That's just the beginning. The real story is what happens next, all the days and years and choices still to come. The work and the love and the growing we'll do together. Evan yawned. I like that story. Can we live it forever? As close to forever as we can manage, Caleb said quietly, his arm around both of them. They sat in comfortable silence until Evan fell asleep between them, his breathing deep and even, his small body relaxed in the absolute trust of a child who knows he's safe and loved. Caleb carried him to bed while Elena stood in the doorway watching. Her husband, her son, her family. Words that had seemed impossible when she'd stepped off that train now felt as natural as breathing. Later, lying in bed in the room that was no longer just Caleb's but theirs, Elena stared at the ceiling and marveled at the strange paths life took. She'd come west, chasing a lie, and found a truth more solid than anything she'd known. She'd been abandoned and found belonging. She'd lost everything and gained more than she'd known to hope for. What are you thinking? Caleb asked in the darkness. That I'm grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because they led me here. He pulled her closer, his warmth solid against her side. I never thought I'd feel this again. Happy, hopeful, like the future was something to look forward to instead of just survive. Sarah would want that for you, for Evan. I think she would have liked you. You're both stubborn as hell when you decide something matters. Elena smiled in the darkness. That's the nicest compliment you could have given me. They fell asleep tangled together, two broken people who'd found a way to fit their jagged edges into something whole. Outside, the ranch settled into night, the horses quiet in the barn, the garden waiting for spring, the land stretching away under stars that had witnessed countless stories of survival and hope and the stubborn human refusal to give up. The winter that followed was hard, as Wyoming winters always were. Snow piled high and winds howled through gaps in the barn siding that needed constant repair. Cattle had to be fed daily, water had to be kept from freezing, and there were days when simply surviving the cold felt like victory enough. But they survived it together, Caleb teaching Elena the rhythms of ranch work in winter, Elena keeping the house warm and the food plentiful, Evan doing his schoolwork by lamplight and helping with whatever tasks his small hands could manage. Spring came eventually, the way it always did, with mud and new calves and the back-breaking work of planting. The garden Elena had rescued the previous summer produced seedlings that grew into strong plants. The ranch turned profitable again, not wealthy but sustainable, providing enough to live on and save a little besides. They fell into the kind of deep partnership that comes from facing hardship together and choosing each other anyway. Some days were easy, full of laughter and good work and the satisfaction of seeing things grow. Other days were hard, marked by disagreements about money or parenting or the thousand small decisions that make up a shared life. But even on the hard days, there was never a question of leaving. They'd both done enough running. This was where they stood. Evan grew tall and capable, taking on more responsibility around the ranch until Caleb started calling him his right-hand man. He never forgot Sarah, keeping her photograph on his nightstand and sometimes telling Elena stories about her that he wanted to preserve. But he also called Elena Mama, without hesitation. And when his school friends asked, he said he was lucky because he had two mothers who loved him, one in heaven and one right here. 2 years after Elena stepped off that train, Mrs. Brennan brought news that Victor Hale had died in prison, his schemes finally catching up with him in the form of rough justice from other inmates. Elena felt nothing at the news except a distant gratitude that he could never hurt anyone else the way he'd tried to hurt her. 3 years after, Elena gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose, Sarah for Caleb's first wife, Rose for Elena's mother. Evan was beside himself with pride, introducing his baby sister to the horses and the garden and every part of the ranch like she needed to learn it all immediately. 5 years after Elena arrived in Stillwater, another woman stepped off the train looking lost and alone, clutching a letter from a man who'd promised her the world and delivered nothing. Someone directed her to the Morgan Ranch, where a woman named Elena had apparently survived a similar situation and might have advice. Elena welcomed her in, sat her down at the kitchen table, poured her coffee, and listened to her story. Then she told her own. Every hard part, every choice, every moment of fear and hope and determination. And when the woman asked what she should do, Elena said what Mrs. Brennan had once said to her. You hold your head up, work hard, and let your actions speak louder than anyone's speculation. This town will judge you at first, but if you give them time and show them who you really are, they'll come around. They always do for the ones who stay and fight. But where do I start? I have nothing. Elena smiled, remembering a younger version of herself saying almost the same words. You start by choosing to stay. Everything else comes from that first choice. The woman stayed. She found work at the general store, rented a room for Mrs. Brennan, and slowly built a life. Elena watched her survive and then thrive, and saw in her journey an echo of her own. The pattern repeated. Lost women finding Stillwater, finding work, finding community, finding that survival could turn into something better if you were willing to fight for it. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Caleb took Elena back to that creek where Evan had first brought her, where Sarah had once come to think. They sat on the smooth rocks with the water flowing past, their hands intertwined, watching autumn leaves drift downstream. Do you ever regret it? Caleb asked. Staying here instead of going somewhere easier? Elena thought about Philadelphia and its cold anonymity, about the cities she could have run to with her restitution money, about all the paths not taken. Not once. This life is hard, but it's mine, ours. That makes all the difference. Even when winter gets brutal and money gets tight and the work never ends? Especially then, because we face it together. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You know what I think about sometimes? That first day when I was so terrified and alone. If someone had told me then what my life would become, this ranch, this family, this belonging, I wouldn't have believed them. I couldn't have imagined being this happy. I couldn't have imagined it either. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was just over, that the best I could hope for was surviving for Evan's sake. Caleb kissed her temple. You taught me that endings can also be beginnings if you're brave enough to let them be. And they sat by the creek until the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Then they walked back to the ranch hand in hand, to the house that was always warm with lamplight and the smell of bread, to the children who would be waiting for dinner and stories and the easy comfort of family routines. Elena stood in the doorway before going inside, looking at the land she'd learned to love, the garden now in its 6th summer, the barn Caleb had rebuilt section by section, the corrals full of horses that Evan helped train, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. This was her kingdom, built from nothing but choice and work and stubborn refusal to give up. She'd arrived in summer with nothing but desperate hope and $45 that turned out to be a lie. She'd stayed through autumn and winter and spring, through trials and triumphs and the 1,000 ordinary moments that made up a life. She'd built a home not by accident or rescue, but by choosing it every single day. And as she stepped inside to the sound of her children's laughter and her husband's voice calling that dinner was almost ready, Elena Parker Morgan knew with absolute certainty that every hard choice, every moment of fear, every time she'd wanted to run but stayed instead, all of it had been worth it. She'd come west looking for a fresh start and found something infinitely better, a place where she belonged, a family that was hers, and a life built on the solid foundation of work and love and the simple courage to stay. This was her story. This was her home. And no matter what challenges tomorrow brought, she would face them the same way she'd faced everything since that first terrifying day in Stillwater, with her head up, her heart open, and the absolute determination to keep building something worth having. The door closed behind her, shutting out the Wyoming evening and holding close the warmth of everything she'd fought so hard to create. Outside, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, bearing witness to one more day in a life lived with purpose and love. And somewhere in the vastness of the American frontier, another woman was boarding a train headed west, chasing her own desperate hope, not knowing yet that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us